joining us. The Washington State PASS team has put a series of videos together to help PASS students learn essential writing skills as PASS students complete their courses. In this video, PASS scores will share tips to crafting an attention-grabbing introduction and conclusion. We hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Where does a writer start when developing an introduction and conclusion for their paper?
First of all, we want to develop a cohesive paper. That means it needs to be tied together tightly. And to do that, you're going to write the body of the paper first. Then go back and write the introduction. The last piece that you will write is your conclusion. Make sure that the conclusion touches back to the introduction, and I'll show you how to do that in the following slides.
Wow, that was really helpful. So after a writer writes the body of the paper, they move on to the introduction. What should the introduction include?
The elements of an introduction are that you need a hook or an attention getter. You've got to grab the audience's attention so that they're going to want to read the rest of what you have to say. You're then going to introduce the authors, the titles of the texts that are used in the body of the paper, and then have 2 or 3 questions that are going to create some kind of a dilemma or problem that could possibly be solved or answered by your thesis statement. And then finally, a thesis statement will be the last sentence in your introduction, and it needs to be a strong statement where you're challenging your readers to do something or telling them that there's a need for something, but it needs to be a strong statement.
You've got my attention, haha. What else can you share about developing the hook or the attention getter?
So to develop an attention getter or hook, the easiest thing to do is to find a really good quote that relates to the topic that you're writing about. If you don't want to use a quote, you can begin with a question or an interesting idea or statistic. But whatever you choose to do, you've got to grab the attention of the reader. Sometimes I use a quote, but more often than not, I use some kind of an interesting idea that I thought of that was related to the topic I was writing about. But with that said, the easiest thing if you're a beginning writer is to just find a really good quote.
As a high school teacher, what tip or tips do you share with your students to ensure that all the elements of an introduction paragraph are included in their paper?
Here's an example. This was an essay written by my grandson 2 years ago in a composition class, and you notice that it's color-coded. I always require my students to color-code their introductions and highlight different things throughout their papers, but there are those 4 elements. You've got to make sure that they're there, and the easiest way to see that they are there is to color code them or highlight them different colors. So you can see here that he's got his quote. It's in the brown at the beginning by Ronald Reagan. Then in blue, it changes color because now we're mentioning the title of the text and the author. In pink, we have the dilemma that's created, the idea that government is taking over and we're depending on it to do everything for us. And finally, in black, he has his thesis statement that we have come to the point where we are expecting things without even working for them. So that's his dilemma. And he's going to write his paper pointing back to this thesis that really this isn't going to work. This is a problem, this idea that government is going to take care of us for everything.
Thanks for sharing that tip and the example. It really highlighted the elements of the introduction. Moving on, at the beginning of the video, you mentioned that the conclusion should always touch back to the introduction. Can you tell us more?
You need to make a connection between the introduction and the conclusion. His conclusion is that anything worth working for or worth having is worth working for. How can we turn the pendulum back to the center, to a point that aligns with what our founding fathers envisioned? This can only happen when we get to the point where we refuse to sit back and allow the government to take care of us. If we do not, there is a high cost, the loss of freedom. The clock is ticking. So in the introduction, my grandson used this quote by Ronald Reagan that says that government was never meant to run our lives. And then he creates the dilemma with questions about the danger of letting government control our lives. And he concludes that anything worth working for is worth having. Making that connection between the introduction and the conclusion also requires the use of specific words. In the introduction, he used the word pendulum. And if you're not familiar with that, it's that part of the clock that swings back and forth. And a clock, if the pendulum swings too far to one side, the clock's not going to work. And it needs to be just regulated near the center, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So using that picture, he's saying the pendulum has swung way too far to one side. And in the conclusion, he says, how do we turn that pendulum back to the center? And then he makes a play on words by saying at the end that if we do not, there is a high cost. The clock is ticking, leaving that sense of urgency for the audience to think about, wow, we must do something. And otherwise, the government is just going to take over our lives. So this clock is ticking ties into the idea of the pendulum, because the pendulum is part of a clock. Notice he doesn't solve the problem. He leaves something at the end for the audience to think about. The audience needs to ponder or think about possible solutions to whatever thesis that you use.
It sounds like it's very important to stay on topic and consider use of keywords in both the introduction and the conclusion. The example seems to be a formal paper where the writer had to do research and write a factual essay. Can you share an example of an informal essay?
This second example is a very informal essay, although it is one of my favorite ones that I've read over the years. She's got this color-coded as well. The first section there that's in the reddish brown is her quote. Then in the second section, in the pink, is her name. I took her name out because she's a student, but her name is there, and then Sisters is the title. Then in the blue, we talk about the dilemma, the teenage hormones colliding. That's the problem. And then finally, she's got her thesis that is one of the cleverest thesis statements that I've ever come across, especially in an informal essay. So nothing messes up your Friday like finding out that it's only Tuesday, as Tuesdays are filled with "I hate you." Well, I hate you more. Student name in her original poem, Sisters, describes words that have rung through many homes through the years. Emotions can run high when teenage hormones collide, and our home is no exception. The insane thing is that with all the words that have flown back and forth between my sister and me, we love each other and are inseparable. Life can be messy, kind of like a Tuesday, but in the end, Friday is always there. The capability to bicker and fight with my sister one day and remain best friends the next is an amazing accomplishment, due to the fact that she and I are both teenagers dealing with our own set of problems and having drama queen-like attitudes. We spend most of our time on Tuesday, always knowing, however, that Friday is always going to come. She's got this clever play on words, with Tuesday representing the everyday messiness of life where people don't always get along, but then using Friday to be that point where, in spite of all the Tuesdays, Friday is there, and that's that idea that we love each other in spite of everything that happens on Tuesday.
Wow, definitely a creative way to connect the introduction and a conclusion in that informal essay. Thanks for sharing. Is there a checklist that you can share with writers to reference when they're developing their own introduction and conclusion?
So, you need to go back and check, does your introduction have a hook or an attention getter? Does the paragraph include an author and a title? Does it have a question or two or even three questions that create a dilemma? Does it have a thesis statement? Okay, it has to have those four things. So your conclusion checklist here is make sure, number one, do not start your conclusion with the words "in conclusion." Do not start your conclusion with the words "all in all." It should smoothly flow from the last body paragraph into the conclusion. You do not need to tell your teacher that it's a conclusion. She has years of schooling and she knows that it's a conclusion. You don't have to tell her or him. Make sure those two things do not show up in your conclusion. Make sure you don't add any new information. If it's not in the body of your essay, then it should never show up in your conclusion. Make sure that the conclusion paragraph touches back to the introduction. Make sure that it rewords the thesis. Don't just restate the thesis, but put it in your own words.
The Washington State PASS team thanks you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget, check out our YouTube channel for other videos with helpful writing tips.